I will tell you a story. Many years ago, I heard these rumors. This is back in the old days of the internet. There was one of those like email forwards you got that suggested there were very few atheists in the US federal prison system. The thing is, and I won't go through the whole history, it was like I saw this statistic popping up everywhere in atheist forums and whatnot. But if you try to trace it back to where they're getting this information from, it always came back to like one person or one name. And it's because they contacted the Federal Bureau of Prisons, but they contacted someone who no longer worked there. It was really hard to trace the origin of this, what I thought was a myth, because I couldn't verify those numbers anywhere. So about a decade ago, I filed a federal Freedom of Information Act request with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And I said, I want to know the religious breakdown of everyone in the US prison system, right? And to my surprise, in 2013, they sent me a response and they gave me a printout of the numbers everywhere. And what ended up happening is, one, I was able to not just confirm that the percentage of atheists, open stated atheists in federal prisons was really low. It was actually lower than the rumor I had heard in the past. Kind of mind-blowing. And I realized, and I know some of you are thinking this, there's a lot of caveats to that. Yes, there are. I'm going to go into those. But basically, for years to come, I kept filing those Freedom of Information Act requests to get updated numbers. And then a few years ago, like starting in 2022, I basically stopped hearing from the government. I would file, like it's in my calendar, like go ahead and file the paperwork. They didn't respond to me. I actually looked up my 2023 request in their database like this week, and it said pending. Like still, really, 2 years later? But I've still filed it every year. And here's the surprising thing. I think about a month and a half ago, I went ahead and filed it this year. And last week or so, I got a response from the government. And they basically said, we found the data you're looking for. We have been cleared to share this information with you. Like we got approval. We're not giving you anything you're not allowed to see. And I can share this data with you right now. Like this is the spreadsheet they sent me. And there's a bunch of things going on here. I realize this is all very tiny font, but I want to share with you a couple things here. Look at the very top, what this says. What this gets us is right here. There's a whole bunch of federal prisons all over the country. And so they have the breakdown. And this is the primary religion that is cited by all these prisoners. And you could see they have a bunch of options here. American Indian, Catholic, Muslim, no preference. There's a bunch of different types of other religions. Atheist, we'll get to that. Buddhist, humanist is the term. We'll talk about that. But they have this listing of all these religions, and then Protestant and unknown. And I'm going to scroll down to the bottom right here just to show you, where did it go? At the very bottom of this list, here's the number that is important. 155,000, a little more than that. 155,000. That's how many prisoners are in the US federal prison system. So then the question comes up, how many atheists are in the federal prison system? And if I scroll for that, here's my atheist list right here. And if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, here is the number right over here, 113. There are 113 atheists out of, what was that number again? 155,000. And if you do the math on that, basically that means atheists, stated open atheists, represent 0.073% of the federal prison population. Less than 0.1% of federal prisoners are out atheists. That's what I got from this database that they sent me. And again, I know millions of caveats, I'm going to get to them. But what that means on paper is that the presence of atheists in US federal prisons is significantly lower than the presence of atheists in the general population. And in case you want to play that game with so that means how many atheists are in the country? Well, atheists represent about 5% of the US population. But again, we are less than 0.1% of the prison population. Catholics, they're 19% of the population. They represent about 12.5% of prisoners. Muslims are 1% of the population, but nearly 10% of inmates. Now, what's with all these discrepancies? Well, first of all, about a third of federal inmates have no stated religious label or non-religious label at all. We don't know what they believe. And the reason humanist is on that list is because about a decade ago, the American Humanist Association filed a lawsuit saying prisoners who were humanists should be allowed to identify with that label and receive the same perks afforded to religious inmates because of that, such as access to meeting space, the ability to discuss their beliefs with larger groups. They said that's a perk religious groups get, and yet our members who are humanists and part of that religion, how come they don't get the same perks? They filed a lawsuit over this. The judges basically sided with the prisoners, and so now the federal prison system keeps track of how many humanists there are as well. And again, on the spreadsheet, 61 inmates are called humanists. And even if all those who identify, even if all of them identified as atheists instead of humanists, we're still less than 0.1% of the federal prison population. Okay, interesting numbers. It is a fun statistic to look at. Here's why I will downplay everything I just told you. Here's why maybe none of that matters. Bunch of reasons for this. One is the way when back in the day, when I heard people citing this statistic, it was to make the argument that atheists are more moral than the rest of the population. But this is why I would urge you not to use this number to defend atheist morality as if religion does not make you a better person or anything like that. Why do people end up in federal prisons? Well, the reasons can be complicated. It's not just that every prisoner is like some sort of murderer. Like high poverty rates affect who goes to prison. Lower formal education levels affect who goes to prison. Plain old racism affects who gets targeted to go to prison. Those are significant factors. And obviously, religious beliefs tend to correlate with many of those things. You know, if you are in a high poverty environment, odds are there's more religion in your community. If you have lower formal education, in some surveys I have seen, it says that is connected with higher religious beliefs, right? PhDs are a lot less religious than people with no high school diploma. Okay, so a lot of the factors that lead to people ditching their religion entirely, like more education, it also helps people avoid the kind of decisions that you might make that might land you in prison. So it's not just about morality. There are so many more factors that people should consider. So this is not a proxy for who's good and who's bad. This number should not be used to suggest that atheists are good while religious people are relatively bad to them. So keep that in mind, right? There's no correlation, not from this data, between religiosity and criminality. And if you've studied anything or read anything about this subject, you know there is systemic racial, socioeconomic disparities in our prison system. So you got to keep that in mind. Here's another thing you should keep in mind. These numbers are also, these labels are all self-reported. Like, we don't know how many more atheist or humanist prisoners might be falling in the category of no preference or other or unknown. For all we know, some of them might have just said, I'm Catholic, whatever, because that's the faith they were raised in. And there are benefits in prison to saying you are religious, right? You might get to leave the premises to go to a church service, and that's better than just sitting in a cell all day. You might get to go to a group Bible discussion, a Bible study, which is more interesting than the alternatives. So there is benefit in prison to saying you're religious. Obviously, if you're trying to get out of prison And maybe the parole board is taking a look at what you've done while you've been behind bars, and they find out, oh, this person's a very religious man. He's been studying the Bible. He's atoned for what he did. Maybe in your head, you think this makes it more likely I'm going to get out of prison. Whereas if you say you're an atheist, that might be used against you. So there are reasons people might say they are religious, even though they're not, right? So they also may be unaware that they could use labels like humanist to get the perks of religion without necessarily believing in God. So keep in mind that these labels are self-reported and people may not want to tell the truth for reasons, whether it stems from ignorance or strategy or anything like that. So that's another caveat. I already mentioned the thing about parole, and maybe if you're an inmate, you don't want to say, let's say you were raised in a religious family, you get arrested, you're going to federal prison, you've been charged with a crime, and they ask you what your religion is. Maybe you don't want to say you're Christian. Maybe some of these people said, I'm atheist, because they didn't want to say, oh man, I went to church as a kid and I still did this, so I'm going to lie about it. You don't know that. Like, there might be reasons people say they are religious to get the benefits associated with it, or they say they're not religious because they're ashamed of admitting they're religious because they were raised differently. Everything I also told you, these are all federal numbers. This is in the federal prison system, but there are more prisons out there at the state level. I don't have the religious demographics of that population. I can't, there's no one-stop shop to get those numbers, so I haven't been able to get them. And the other thing to keep in mind is, I don't know when all this data was acquired. Like, is it when the prisoners are first admitted into prison? What if they change their minds while they're in prison? And how well do these labels reflect what they currently think about God? I don't know. We don't have those answers. One legal expert I talked to said it's likely some of these identifiers were pulled from a pre-sentencing report or just designated by the individuals somewhere on some piece of paperwork. And if you're a Christian who goes to church on Christmas and Easter, you might not go out of your way to make sure your religious label is accurate to get the benefits that might come with it. Like, so you got to take these at face value and not look way beyond that to make these generalizations that may not be fair. There's not a lot you can infer from this data as much as I want to, but even with all those caveats, I do think there is some benefit to having these numbers on paper, because I think even when you consider the caveats, it does counter the assumption that I think some religious conservatives have, that immoral atheists are to blame for a lot of the problems in society. Because I think if you ask conservative Christians, do you think there are more or less atheists in prison compared to the rates in the general population? I think there's a lot of conservatives, a lot of pastors who would say the federal prison system is full of atheists who then maybe convert in prison. And the fact is that is not true. There's no data whatsoever suggesting anything even close to that, right? Like, if you are religious, the thinking is you would never do something so awful that could land you behind bars, or that if you do any of those things, you are not a real Christian. But if Protestants make up about 17% of the federal prison population, and Catholics make up 19%, and Muslims make up nearly 10%, which we know is true because that's what the labels say, I think it's harder to argue that all of those people are exaggerating their beliefs. Many of them are probably accurately telling you what they believe. And I think these numbers are helpful because it makes us have a deeper discussion about our prison system as a whole and the role religion plays before, during, and after entering it. Handing prisoners a Bible is not going to make them better people when they're behind bars. Requiring them to meet with religious chaplains or listening to visiting ministers or participating in Bible studies when they don't believe this shit is not going to make them better people. The path to redemption doesn't have to go through God. That's kind of the bottom line here. So I find it interesting, despite the caveats, and I just want to be clear, I acknowledge all the caveats, But I do think it's interesting that this information is out there, and I'm going to keep trying to get it every year because I want to see how that changes over the course of the next several years. So I will leave it at that. Let me just run through and see if there are any other questions here before I move on to another story. This is an interesting thing. A conservative Christian often pulls their trump card of, as an atheist, what keeps you from raping and killing? And I maybe this is something Matt Dillahunty once said, but as an atheist, nothing is stopping me from doing those things. I do those things as often as I want to do them, which is never. And if you need God to prevent you from doing any of those horrible things, it sounds like you're the problem. I'm paraphrasing Dillahunty, obviously. He said it very well. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to just consider how wrong that assumption is.